Old people smell like mothballs and desperation. The words floated up from the garden below my study window, slicing through the warm summer afternoon and into my heart. The laughter that followed was equally painful, young, carefree, and cruelly dismissive. My own flesh and blood, my grandchildren, huddled together on the terrace I'd built for them, mocking the very person who'd given them everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Rosalind Everly Blackwood, 72 years old, former ED, Chief Justice of the Northeastern Circuit Court, and apparently, according to my grandchildren, I smell like death warmed over. I sat frozen at my antique mahogany desk, the estate paperwork I'd been reviewing suddenly forgotten as their conversation continued below, unaware of my open window just above them. "God, when she hugged me, I almost gagged," said Juniper, my eldest granddaughter, the same girl whose law school tuition I paid in full. "That perfume she wears is from, like, the Great Depression or something." "It's not just the perfume," replied my grandson Thorne, whose voice had the unmistakable lazy drawl of someone who'd been drinking my imported whiskey. "It's that old person smell, like it's in her skin or something. Biological warfare." More laughter. I felt a hot flush of shame rise up my neck, followed by anger so intense my hands trembled as I reached for my reading glasses. "Well, we only have to pretend to care for one more weekend," said my youngest granddaughter, Laurel. "Then we're back to our regular lives, and old Granny Justice can go back to talking to her dead husband's portrait and not bother us until Christmas." "If she even makes it to Christmas," said Juniper with a snort. "She'll outlive us all out of spite," said Thorne. "But at least we know it'll be worth it in the end. Dad says her estate is worth millions, and the trust fund is ironclad." I pressed a handkerchief to my mouth, not trusting myself to breathe normally. 35 years on the bench had taught me to maintain composure in the face of the most disturbing testimonies, but nothing had prepared me for hearing my grandchildren reveal their true feelings about me. My journey to wealth was neither quick nor easy. I was born in the coal mining town of Everton Ridge, where my father worked the deep tunnels and my mother took in laundry from the mining executives' families. Our home was a 2-room cabin with no indoor plumbing until I was 12. My earliest memories are tinged with the scent of lye soap and the perpetual coal dust that seemed to settle on every surface, no matter how often we cleaned. Education was my salvation. I studied by oil lamp after finishing my chores, determined to create a different life. When most girls in my town were planning weddings, I was planning escape routes. I won a scholarship to Westlake College for Women, becoming the first person in my family to continue education beyond the 8th grade. Law school followed, though the dean suggested on my first day that I'd be taking a man's place and should reconsider my choices. I graduated second in my class, the only woman among 73 men. My first job offer came with the stipulation that I wouldn't expect to try cases. They needed someone to handle research and paperwork. I declined and started my own practice instead. I met Harrison Blackwood when he brought a civil rights case to my door after 5 other attorneys turned him away. He was representing a group of black miners who had been systematically denied safer working conditions. Harrison's passion for justice matched my own, and within a year, we were married and partners in more ways than one. Our practice grew as we took on cases others deemed too controversial or difficult. We represented workers against powerful corporations, women facing discrimination, and communities fighting environmental destruction. We won more than we lost, made powerful enemies, and lifelong friends. When Harrison was appointed to the federal bench, I continued our practice alone until I, too, was called to judicial service. Our children, Eleanor and James, grew up in the courthouse almost as much as at home. They watched us work 14-hour days, saw the threats that occasionally came with challenging power, and learned early that wealth wasn't our goal. Justice was. The money came later, through careful investments and Harrison's family estate that had once seemed like an afterthought. Eleanor married a surgeon, Lawrence, and they had Juniper and Laurel. James married an artist, Vivian, and they had Thorn. My grandchildren grew up with privileges I could hardly have imagined in my Coaltown childhood. Private schools, summer camps, international vacations, and the certainty that college would be paid for without question. Harrison and I established trust funds for each grandchild when they were born. We structured them carefully, with quarterly distributions beginning at age 25 and full access at 35. The amounts would ensure they never faced true hardship, while hopefully not destroying their ambition or work ethic. We weren't naive. We'd seen wealth corrupt too many families to create trust funds without safeguards. After Harrison died 5 years ago, I threw myself into philanthropy and mentoring young attorneys, particularly women and those from disadvantaged backgrounds. I established scholarships, funded legal clinics, and continued to live in our home, Blackwood Manor, where we'd hosted dignitaries, activists, and scholars over our 50-year marriage. I invited my grandchildren to stay with me for a month each summer, partly to maintain our connection, and partly because both Eleanor and James had begun to hint that the 20-room historic home was too much for me to manage alone. I suspected they were more concerned about property values than my welfare, but I refused to downsize from the home Harrison and I had lovingly restored over decades. This summer's visit was the first time all 3 grandchildren had coordinated their schedules to be here simultaneously since Harrison's funeral. Juniper, now 27 and an associate at a prestigious law firm, had been the most difficult to pin down. Thorn, 25 and ostensibly working on a novel no one had seen, had the most flexible schedule but the least interest. Laurel, 23 and just graduated from business school, had agreed immediately, which should have been my first clue that something was different. They arrived yesterday in Laurel's new convertible, bringing the chaotic energy of youth into my quiet home. Mrs. Hudson, my housekeeper of 30 years, had prepared their favorite meals and turned down their childhood bedrooms. I'd spent days ensuring everything would be perfect, even having Mr. Finch, the gardener, plant fresh lavender in the garden beds because Juniper had once mentioned liking the scent. Our reunion dinner had been pleasant enough, though I noticed how they checked their phones beneath the table and exchanged glances when I mentioned potential activities for their stay. Thorn had excused himself early, claiming fatigue from the drive, though I later heard him leave the house around 11. He returned at dawn, stumbling on the front steps loudly enough to wake me. And now, not even 24 hours into their visit, I was confronted with the truth. They didn't love me. They barely tolerated me. The relationship I thought we had, complicated by distance perhaps, but fundamentally sound, was a performance, a calculation, a waiting game with my death as the finish line and my money as the prize. I sat at my desk long after they moved. From the terrace to the pool, their conversation shifting to vacation plans and workplace gossip. I removed my reading glasses and looked around my study, at the photographs of Harrison and me receiving various honors, at our children's wedding. Portraits, at the framed finger paintings my grandchildren had made me years ago. Had it all been transactional? Had the finger paintings been prompted by parents who knew where the inheritance would come from? Had the thank you notes for birthday checks and graduation gifts been written under duress, with eye rolls and sighs? My hand moved to the estate planning documents I'd been reviewing when I overheard them. I was making minor adjustments to charitable contributions, ensuring my former clerk's daughter's education would be covered, updating provisions for Mrs. Hudson's retirement. I hadn't planned to make substantial changes to the grandchildren's trusts until now. I opened my laptop and sent an urgent message to Reginald Hargrove, my attorney of 30 years. Need to meet today. Trust amendments. Urgent. His response came within minutes. Can be at your home by 4 p.m. Everything all right? Fine, I replied. Just need to correct an oversight. I spent the next hour in deep thought, occasionally gazing out the window at my grandchildren lounging by the pool, mimosas in hand at barely noon. They looked so carefree, so entitled. I tried to remember myself at their age, already 10 years into my legal career, working 60-hour weeks while pregnant with Eleanor, collapsing into bed beside Harrison, too exhausted to even discuss the day's events. Had we done them a disservice, sheltering them from struggle? Had our attempt to give them advantages we never had instead robbed them of the character-building hardships that shaped us? Or were they simply self-absorbed in the way many young people are, unaware of how their careless words could wound? It didn't matter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The trust funds had always contained morality clauses, provisions that could reduce distributions for criminal behavior or addiction issues. But there was nothing in them about basic human decency or respect. That had been our mistake. I pulled the antique bell rope beside my desk, summoning Mrs. Hudson. When she appeared at my study door, her face showed immediate concern. In 30 years, I had rarely used the bell system that came with the historic home. "Are you unwell, Justice Blackwood?" she asked, using the title she had never abandoned despite my retirement. "I'm fine, Ida," I said, using her first name, as I did only in our most private conversations. "But I need your help with something delicate." I explained what I'd overheard and what I planned to do. Mrs. Hudson's expression shifted from shock to a tight-lipped anger I'd rarely seen. "Those ungrateful," she began, then caught herself. "Forgive me, ma'am. That's not my place." "It's exactly your place," I said. "You've been more family to me these 30 years than those children lounging by the pool, which is partly why I need your help now." I outlined my plan. Mrs. Hudson listened carefully, occasionally nodding or offering refinements. When I finished, she straightened her shoulders in the way she did when tackling a particularly challenging household task. "I'll see to the arrangements," she said. "And Justice Blackwood? For what it's worth, you smell like lavender and sandalwood. Always have." A laugh escaped me, unexpected and slightly watery. "Thank you, Ida. That's oddly comforting to know." After she left, I turned back to my computer and began drafting a new trust amendment. My legal mind, honed by decades of precise language and anticipating countermoves, worked quickly and efficiently. By the time Reginald arrived, I had a complete first draft ready for his review. "This is substantial," he said after reading it through twice. "May I ask what prompted such a significant change?" "Let's just say I've received new information about my beneficiaries' characters," I replied. "Is it legally sound?" Reginald tapped his fingers on the document, a habit from our earliest days working together. "It's sound, but it will be controversial. They could contest it after your death, claim undue influence or diminished capacity. Which is why we'll do this properly. I want a full cognitive assessment done next week. Schedule it with Dr. Winters. I want the signing videotaped with multiple witnesses, including non-beneficiaries. And I want a letter explaining my reasoning placed in your vault, to be opened only if there's a contest." He raised his eyebrows. "You're expecting a fight." "I'm ensuring they don't have grounds for one," I corrected. "You know me better than to think I'd leave loose ends." Reginald nodded slowly. "What about Eleanor and James? How do you think they'll react?" I hadn't allowed myself to think too deeply about my children's response. Would they be angry on their children's behalf? Or would they understand that this was ultimately about values, not punishment? "They raised these young adults," I said finally. "They bear some responsibility for the outcome. But this doesn't affect them directly. Their inheritances remain unchanged." "Very well," Reginald said. "I'll have this redrafted with proper legal language by tomorrow. We can execute it before I leave." "No," I said. "I want it done tonight. The grandchildren are already planning an evening out. They'll leave around 7. Come back at 8 with the notary and witnesses." He looked as if he might object, but then nodded. "As you wish. 8 o'clock." After he left, I rejoined. My grandchildren by the pool, bringing a tray of fresh lemonade and cookies that Mrs. Hudson had prepared. They scrambled to hide their phones as I approached, plastering on smiles that now seemed so obviously forced. I wondered how I hadn't noticed before. "Thought you might like a snack," I said, setting down the tray. "Thanks, Granny," said Laurel, reaching for a cookie. "We were just talking about dinner plans. There's a new restaurant in town we wanted to try. That Italian place on Riverside?" "Bellini's," I supplied. "Yes, it's quite good. Harrison and I went there for our anniversary last year." I didn't mention that the owner, Mr. Bellini, was a former client who still sent me a Christmas card every year and had named a pasta dish after me. "You've been there?" Thorne seemed genuinely surprised that I might do something as current as visiting a new restaurant. "I do occasionally leave the manor," I said dryly. "Even us ancients need feeding." Juniper had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable at my choice of words. "We didn't mean to exclude you, Granny. We just thought it might be too lively for your taste." "Considerate of you," I said, not bothering to hide my sarcasm. "But please, don't alter your plans on my account. Mrs. Hudson is making her famous pot roast for me tonight." "We'll be back by 11, Laurel promised, as if this were reassurance rather than an indication of how brief their dinner would be. "Take your time," I said. "At my age, I'm asleep by 9 anyway." This was a lie. I often worked on legal briefs for my pro bono cases until well past midnight, but they nodded knowingly, clearly relieved. I excused myself and returned to the house, stopping briefly in Harrison's study where his portrait hung above the fireplace. We'd commissioned it for his retirement from the bench, and the artist had captured his essence perfectly, the keen intelligence in his eyes, the slight quirk of his mouth that suggested he was privy to a joke others might miss. "You always said I was too soft on them," I murmured to the painting. "You wouldn't be surprised by any of this." The day passed slowly as I waited for evening. I reviewed case files for a women's legal clinic I advised, made several calls to former colleagues, and joined Mrs. Hudson in the kitchen to discuss menu plans for the rest of the grandchildren's stay, now potentially shorter than originally scheduled. At 6:30, I heard the grandchildren's preparations for their night out. Showers running, music playing, occasional bursts of laughter that now sounded hollow to my ears. They appeared downstairs at 7, dressed for an evening much more substantial than a casual dinner at Bellini's. Juniper wore a cocktail dress I recognized as costing more than my first month's salary as an attorney. Thorne sported a blazer with designer logos subtly emblazoned on the buttons. Laurel's jewelry alone could have funded a semester at the state university. "Don't wait up," Juniper called as they headed out the door. "Wouldn't dream of it," I replied, smiling and waving from the foyer. The moment their car disappeared down the long driveway, the house sprang into action. Mrs. Hudson had arranged for the dining room to be set up for the signing, with proper lighting for video recording. At precisely 8, Reginald arrived with his assistant, a notary public, and 2 paralegals to serve as witnesses. By 8:30, I had signed the new trust amendments, the video documentation was complete, and the witnesses had departed. Reginald lingered, clearly still concerned. "Rosalind, are you certain about this? It's not too late to reconsider." I walked him to the door, feeling lighter than I had all day. "I've never been more certain of anything in my judicial career. This isn't about revenge, Reginald. It's about legacy." "The money is quite significant," he reminded me. "The change in terms will come as a considerable shock." "Money has never been the most valuable thing I had to give them," I said. "Perhaps this will help them understand that." After he left, I changed into my nightgown and robe, not because I was ready for bed, but because I wanted to be comfortable for what came next. I took a small vial from my vanity drawer, the custom perfume Harrison had commissioned for our 40th anniversary from a perfumer in Grasse. Notes of lavender, sandalwood, and bergamot, created to complement my natural scent. I dabbed it behind my ears and on my wrists, then settled into the wingback chair in my bedroom with a leather-bound volume of poetry Harrison and I had often read to each other. I heard the grandchildren return just after midnight, their voices carrying up the grand staircase as they tried and failed to be quiet. I waited until the house had been silent for half an hour before putting my plan into motion. First, I called Eleanor in London, where it would be early morning. I rarely called my daughter directly, usually scheduling our conversations in advance via email, so I wasn't surprised when her voice was immediately alert with concern. "Mom, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, dear," I said. "I just wanted to let you know I've made some changes to the trust funds for the children." A pause. "What kind of changes?" "Significant ones," I replied. "They'll need to meet certain conditions to receive the full amounts now." Another, longer pause. "Mom, it's 5 in the morning here. Can we discuss this later?" "Of course," I said pleasantly. "I've already emailed the documents to you. Review them when you have time. I just didn't want you to be blindsided when Reginald contacts you officially tomorrow." "Does this have something to do with the grandkids' visit?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharpening. "Has something happened?" "Nothing dramatic," I assured her. "Just a clarification of values. We can talk more later." "Go back to sleep, dear." I made a similar call to James in Vancouver, where it would be evening. His reaction was more immediate. "What did they do?" he asked directly. "It's not what they did," I said. "It's who they are. Or rather, who they've come." James sighed heavily. "Mom, they're young. Whatever they've done or said reflects the values they've developed as adults," I finished for him. "This isn't punitive, James. It's corrective." After hanging up with my son, I moved to the final phase of my evening plan. I walked quietly down the hallway to the guest wing where my grandchildren were sleeping. Outside each door, I placed an envelope with their name handwritten in my distinctive judicial script, the same handwriting that had signed countless opinions affecting thousands of lives. Inside each envelope was an identical note. "I've heard what you truly think of me. Not just today, but in your actions for years now. Tonight, I changed the terms of your trust funds. You'll each still receive your quarterly stipend, but the full distribution at 35 is now conditional. If you're interested in the new terms, join me for breakfast at 9 a.m. If not, your rooms should be vacated by noon. Either way, I suggest you consider what values you want to guide your life beyond my death and the money you've been waiting for. With disappointment, but enduring hope, Grandmother." I slipped each envelope under their respective doors and returned to my room. Finally, ready for sleep. Whatever happened in the morning, I had reclaimed something essential: my dignity, my authority, and most importantly, my legacy. I barely slept that night. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed every hour, each resonant gong reminding me of the confrontation that awaited with the morning light. At 5, I gave up on sleep entirely and moved to my private sitting room, where I watched dawn break over the sprawling gardens of Blackwood Manor. The eastern sky turned from indigo to lavender to a brilliant gold, nature's reminder that renewal follows even the darkest night. By 7, I had showered, dressed in a tailored navy suit, my judicial armor, as Harrison used to call it, and instructed Mrs. Hudson on breakfast arrangements. I chose my attire deliberately, not the comfortable slacks and cashmere sweater my grandchildren were accustomed to seeing me in, but the formal wear that had commanded respect in courtrooms for decades. Today was, after all, a type of hearing. Evidence had been presented, judgment rendered, and now came sentencing, or perhaps an opportunity for rehabilitation. "The usual for breakfast, Justice Blackwood?" Mrs. Hudson asked when I entered the kitchen. No, I said. Something more substantial today. The works, eggs, bacon, those scones they've always loved, fresh fruit, good coffee. Make it look like a celebration. Mrs. Hudson raised an eyebrow but nodded. A last meal, is it? I smiled thinly. Let's call it a transitional one. At precisely 8:55, I took my seat at the head of the breakfast table in the morning room, a bright space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rose garden. I placed 3 identical folders at each place setting where my grandchildren would sit, each containing a copy of the trust amendments, along with financial projections showing exactly what they stood to lose if they failed to meet the new conditions. The first to appear was Laurel, always the early riser. She entered cautiously, my envelope held between 2 fingers as if it might bite. Her eyes were puffy from crying or lack of sleep, her usually meticulous appearance slightly disheveled. "Good morning, Laurel," I said calmly, gesturing to her usual seat. "Coffee?" She sat without answering, placing the envelope on the table between us like a gauntlet. "What is this, grandmother?" "Exactly what it says," I replied, pouring her coffee without asking how she took it. Black, 1 sugar, unchanged since she was 16. A notification that the terms of your trust have been modified. "You can't just—" "I most certainly can," I interrupted, my tone leaving no room for argument. "The trust documents have always given me that authority. You simply never imagined I would exercise it." Thorne arrived next, shuffling in with the hangdog expression of someone experiencing both emotional shock and a hangover. His envelope was crumpled, shoved carelessly into the pocket of his wrinkled linen pants. "What the hell, Granny?" said, dropping heavily into his chair. "Language, Thorne," I said automatically. "And good morning to you, too." Juniper was last, entering with the confident stride of someone prepared for battle. Unlike her siblings, she had taken the time to compose herself fully. Hair perfectly arranged, makeup flawless, in a crisp white blouse and dark slacks that mimicked my own formal attire. Of the 3, she had always been most like me. Strategic, controlled, formidable. She carried her envelope unopened. "This is about yesterday, isn't it?" she said without preamble, remaining standing while her siblings sat in awkward silence. "In part," I acknowledged. "Please sit down. Mrs. Hudson has prepared a lovely breakfast." "I'm not hungry," Juniper said, though she did take her seat. Placing the envelope precisely in front of her, parallel to the edge of the table. "I'd prefer to address whatever this is directly." As if on cue, Mrs. Hudson entered with a tray laden with breakfast foods, the rich aroma of bacon and freshly baked scones filling the room. Despite their protestations, both Thorne and Laurel immediately helped themselves. Juniper did not. "I overheard your conversation on the terrace yesterday," I said once Mrs. Hudson had left, seeing no reason to delay the inevitable. "Every word of it." Color drained from Laurel's face. Thorne froze mid-bite. Juniper's expression remained impassive, though a muscle twitched in her jaw. "You were eavesdropping on us?" Juniper asked, attempting to seize the moral high ground. "I was sitting at my desk by an open window," I corrected. "But yes, I heard you discuss my old person smell, your reluctance to hug me, and your anticipation of my death and the subsequent financial windfall. Among other things." Laurel's eyes filled with tears. "Grandmother, we didn't mean—" "Don't." I cut her off, not unkindly but firmly. "Don't diminish yourself with lies on top of cruelty. You meant every word, and that is your right. You're entitled to your opinions and your feelings, however hurtful they may be. What you're not entitled to is my money." "So you're disinheriting us?" Thorne asked, his voice rising in panic. "Because of some stupid jokes?" "No," I said. "I'm not disinheriting you. I'm modifying the terms under which you receive your inheritance. Open your folders, please." They did so with varying degrees of reluctance. Inside, each found identical documents: the legal amendment to their trust funds, followed by a more reader-friendly summary of the changes. And finally, the financial projections showing potential outcomes based on their choices going forward. As you can see, I continued as they scanned the papers, the quarterly stipends will continue unchanged. You'll still receive enough to supplement a reasonable lifestyle, approximately $12,000 per quarter. What has changed are the conditions for receiving the full distribution at age 35. Community service? Juniper said incredulously, looking up from the document. 5,000 hours of it? Spread over the next 8 to 12? Years, depending on your current age, I confirmed. That's approximately 10 hours per week, hardly unreasonable. And we have to work full-time jobs for at least 7 of those years? Thorne looked as if I'd suggested he swim across the Atlantic. With performance evaluations? Yes, in fields of your choosing naturally. The evaluations are simply to confirm you're actually working, not merely occupying a desk purchased by family connections. We have to live on a restricted budget and document our expenses. Laurel's voice cracked. With financial counseling sessions? Monthly sessions for the first year, quarterly thereafter, I nodded. You'll be given a reasonable budget, based on average income for your age and location, plus your stipend. The goal is to teach financial responsibility, not impose hardship. This is insane, Juniper said, closing her folder with a snap. It's controlling and manipulative. It's punishment for a private conversation you weren't meant to hear. Is that your legal opinion, counselor? I asked mildly. You know, it's not, she replied, flushing. I haven't practiced long enough to specialize in trust law. Well, allow me to offer mine, after 45 years in the legal profession, I said. These amendments are entirely legal, properly executed, witnessed and documented. They cannot be contested on grounds of mental capacity, as I've already arranged for cognitive testing to be conducted next week. They cannot be contested on grounds of undue influence, as the witnesses were independent and the signing was videotaped. And they cannot be contested on the basis of their content, as the original trust documents explicitly granted me the authority to modify terms. I paused, allowing this to sink in before continuing. But more importantly, these changes aren't punitive, they're corrective. I'm not taking away your inheritance because you hurt my feelings. I'm restructuring it because you've revealed a fundamental character flaw that money would only exacerbate. Character flaw? Thorne repeated indignantly. Because we made some stupid jokes? No, I said. Because you see people, not just me, but everyone, as means to ends rather than as human beings worthy of dignity and respect, regardless of what they can provide you. That worldview will poison every relationship you ever have, and giving you unfettered access to millions would only reinforce it. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Mrs. Hudson returned to refill coffee cups, her expression carefully, neutral though I caught the slight nod of approval she gave me when the grandchildren weren't looking. So what now? Laurel finally asked, her voice small. We just have to do all this stuff, or lose everything. Not everything, I corrected. As I said, the quarterly stipends continue regardless. You won't be destitute. But the principal, sums will be redirected to charitable foundations if you choose not to meet the conditions. And if we contest the changes? Juniper asked, the lawyer in her already seeking loopholes. You're welcome to try, I said. The legal expenses would come from your stipends, not the principal, and based on my assessment, you would not prevail. But more importantly, any contest would trigger an immediate redirection of the principal to the backup charitable beneficiaries. You'd be spending your own money to ensure you definitely receive nothing. Thorne pushed away from the table abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. This is bull! He caught himself, glancing at my raised eyebrow. This is unfair. You're trying to control our lives from beyond the grave. On the contrary, I replied calmly, I'm trying to ensure you have the tools to live your lives well while I'm still here to see it. The conditions expire when you're 35, hardly beyond the grave given actuarial tables for someone my age. So we have no choice, Juniper said flatly. You have exactly the choices all of us have in life, I said. You can work for what you want, or you can decide it's not worth the effort and pursue something else. That's not punishment. That's, reality. Reality for people who weren't promised millions since birth, Thorne muttered. And therein lies the problem, I said softly. You came to see something that was intended as a gift, as my and your grandfather's expression of love and desire for your security, as an entitlement. Something owed to you simply for existing. That mindset would destroy you long before the money ran out. I rose from my chair, signaling that the conversation was drawing to a close. You don't need to decide this moment. Take the day to review the documents fully. Consider what you value more, easy money or your integrity and independence. I'll be in my study if you have questions, but the terms are non-negotiable. I left them sitting in stunned silence, their breakfasts largely untouched except for Thorne's stress eating of 3 scones. As I walked away, I heard Juniper hiss, "Did either of you check if your rooms were bugged too? God knows what else," she heard. I smiled to myself, knowing they would be searching their rooms for listening devices for hours. Sometimes a little paranoia was educational in itself. In my study, I found a fresh pot of tea waiting, along with a plate of Mrs. Hudson's shortbread cookies, her silent way of showing solidarity. I settled into my chair and picked up the legal brief I'd been reviewing yesterday before the overheard conversation had changed everything. Life, after all, continued. The morning passed quietly. I half expected an immediate exodus, slamming doors and squealing tires as my grandchildren fled the scene of their humiliation. Instead, an uneasy silence hung over the manor, occasionally, broken by hushed but heated conversations from the garden or library, quickly silenced whenever I appeared. Around noon, there was a soft knock at my study door. I looked up to find Laurel hovering in the doorway, her expression uncertain. "May I come in, grandmother?" "Of course," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Have you made your decision already?" Laurel sat, fidgeting with the charm bracelet I'd given her for her 16th birthday. "Not exactly. I wanted to say I'm sorry. What I said was cruel and thoughtless." I studied her carefully, trying to determine if this was genuine remorse or calculated damage control. With Laurel, the youngest and most emotionally expressive of my grandchildren, it was often difficult to tell where authentic feeling ended and performance began. "Thank you for the apology," I said neutrally. "May I ask what prompted it?" She looked down at her hands. "I've been thinking about what you said about seeing people as means to ends, and I realized that's exactly what we were doing. We weren't seeing you as our grandmother, as a person with feelings. We were seeing you as a bank account with an expiration date." She winced at her own words. "That sounds horrible when I say it out loud." "It is horrible," I agreed. "But recognizing it is the first step toward changing it." "The thing is," Laurel continued hesitantly, "I'm not even sure when it happened. When we were kids, we loved coming here. Remember how you used to let us help you in the garden? Or when Grandpa would read to us in the library? When did we stop seeing that and start just seeing the money?" I felt a small crack in the armor I'd wrapped around my heart since yesterday. "I've been wondering the same thing. Mom and Dad, they talk about your estate all the time," Laurel admitted, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Not maliciously, exactly, just matter-of-factly. When Mom's gone, we'll need to decide what to do with the house. The trusts will mature when the kids are 35. Like it's just administrative details to be managed." I nodded, unsurprised but still disappointed. And that shaped how you viewed your relationship with me. I guess so, Laurel said. But that doesn't— excuse what I said, or how I've been acting. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. I don't want to be that person, grandmother. The kind who measures relationships by what I can get from them. Then don't be, I said simply. Is that why you changed the trusts? To force us to be better people? I considered this carefully. Not to force you, no. To create conditions that might guide you toward becoming the people I believe you can be. People your grandfather would have been proud of. Laurel was quiet for a moment, twisting her bracelet around her wrist. Do you think Grandpa would have been disappointed in us? In who we've become? The question caught me off guard with its vulnerability. Your grandfather had very high standards, I said carefully. For himself, for me, for your parents. He expected people to live up to their potential, but he was also deeply compassionate about human frailty. That's not really an answer, Laurel said with a small smile. No, it's not, I agreed. The truth is, I don't know what he would think. I know he would be hurt by what I heard yesterday, but I also know he believed in redemption, in the capacity for people to recognize their mistakes and grow from them. Like I'm trying to do now. Perhaps, I said, still unwilling to make this too easy. Time will tell if this is a momentary reaction to consequences or a genuine change of heart. Laurel nodded, accepting this. Juniper and Thorn are furious, you know. Juniper's already researching ways to contest the changes. I expected as much, I said. Your sister has always been tenacious. She says you're using your knowledge of the law to manipulate us, that it's a form of elder abuse in reverse. I couldn't help but laugh at that. I'd be fascinated to see her argue that position before the court. Creative, I'll give her that. Laurel's expression grew serious again. I think I want to try. To meet the conditions, I mean. Not just for the money, but because maybe I need this. Structure, purpose, something beyond just waiting for an inheritance. I felt a flutter of hope, quickly tempered by caution. I'm glad to hear that. But remember, this isn't something you can fake your way through. The community service organizations will require consistent commitment. The employers will expect actual work. The financial counselors will need genuine engagement. I know, Laurel said. It's scary, actually. I've never really had to persist at anything difficult before. Everything's always been arranged for me. That's precisely the problem these changes are meant to address, I said. Life isn't arranged. It's earned, day by day, choice by choice. Laurel stood, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. Will you help me? If I decide to do this, I wouldn't even know where to start with finding the right community service organization or how to budget properly. I felt something shift between us. A tentative bridge forming over the chasm yesterday's revelations had opened. Yes, I said. I will help you, but not by doing it for you. I understand, she said. She hesitated, then moved around the desk and bent to kiss my cheek. The first spontaneous affection she'd shown me in years. I really am sorry, grandmother. About what I said, about the person I've been becoming. After she left, I sat motionless, my hand drifting to my cheek where she'd kissed me. Was this progress, or simply the most effective manipulation yet? Time would tell, but the judge in me, the woman who had spent decades evaluating testimony and character, wanted to believe it was genuine. The afternoon brought another visitor to my study. Thorn, looking considerably less contrite than his younger sister. He sprawled in the visitor's chair without invitation, his posture deliberately casual, though his eyes betrayed his tension. So Laurel's drinking the Kool-Aid, he said without preamble. I believe she's considering her options thoughtfully, I replied. As I hope you are as well. Thorne snorted. My options are pretty clear. Jump through hoops for the next decade or kiss millions goodbye. Not much to consider. If that's how you see it, perhaps the money isn't right for you at this time, I said. He leaned forward, dropping the pretense of casualness. Let's cut the crap, Granny. This is about control. You're pissed we don't worship the ground you. Walk on, so you're using the only leverage you have. Money. An interesting theory, I said calmly. Tell me, Thorne, what exactly have you done with your life thus far that would warrant worship? Or even basic respect? He flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's not fair. Isn't it? You've had every advantage. The best schools, financial support, family connections. Yet, at 25, what have you accomplished? Your novel remains theoretical. Your employment history is spotty at best. Your relationships seem primarily transactional. So I ask again, on what basis should I or anyone else respect you beyond the basic dignity afforded to all human beings? You don't know anything about my life, he muttered, though the fight was draining from his voice. I know you charged $30,000 to your credit card last year for nightclubs and designer clothes, I said. I know you've started and abandoned 4 different career paths in 3 years. I know you told people at the Williams wedding that you were just waiting for your grandmother to kick it, so you could really start living. His head snapped up, genuine shock in his eyes. How did you— I may be old, Thorne, but I'm not isolated. I have friends, many of whom have grandchildren who move in the same social circles you do. People talk, especially about spectacular displays of entitlement and disrespect. Thorne slumped in his chair, the facade of indifference finally crumbling. So what am I supposed to do? Pretend to be someone I'm not for a decade just to get what's rightfully mine? Nothing is rightfully yours except what you earn, I said. And I'm not asking you to pretend. I'm asking you to become someone worthy of the opportunities you've been given. Someone your grandfather would recognize as his descendant. At the mention of Harrison, something flickered in Thorne's eyes, a shadow of genuine emotion. Of all the grandchildren he had been closest to Harrison, spending hours in his grandfather's workshop learning to carve wood and restore antique furniture. That connection had been real, unlike the performance of affection he'd been giving me for years. Grandpa would have understood me, he said, his voice catching slightly. He wouldn't have judged me like this. Your grandfather believed in standards, Thorne, in responsibility, in using privilege to serve others, not just yourself. He would have been profoundly disappointed by who you've become. Thorne stood, abruptly, sending his chair skidding backward. You don't get to tell me what he would have thought. You don't know everything despite what you think. I knew him better than anyone on this earth, I said, keeping my voice level despite the surge of anger I felt. We were married for 50 years. If anyone can speak to what Harrison valued, it's me. Whatever, Thorne said, reverting to adolescent dismissal in the face of uncomfortable truth. I'm not playing this game. Keep your money. I'll figure something out. As he stalked toward the door, I called after him. He kept every wooden boat you carved together. They're still on the shelf in his workshop. He believed in you, Thorne. Long after you stopped believing in yourself. Thorne paused in the doorway, his back to me, shoulders tight with emotion. For a moment I thought he might turn back, might let down the defensive wall he'd built between us. Instead, he continued out without another word, closing the door, firmly behind him. I sighed, feeling every one of my 72 years. 2 down, 1 to go, and Juniper would undoubtedly be the most challenging conversation of all. But Juniper didn't come. Hours passed, the afternoon sun slanted into evening shadows, and my most formidable grandchild maintained her distance. Mrs. Hudson brought me dinner on a tray, reporting that Juniper had taken her meal in her room and appeared to be packing. At precisely 7:30 the next morning, a knock came at my bedroom door with such precise, measured force that I knew instantly it was Juniper, Unlike her siblings' emotional reactions, she would have spent the night strategizing, weighing options, and preparing for this conversation as she would for a legal negotiation. "Come in," I called, already dressed and seated at my reading table with a cup of Earl Grey tea. I'd anticipated an early morning visit. Juniper entered, impeccably attired, in a sleek gray pantsuit that reminded me painfully of my own courtroom wardrobe at her age. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm, a prop for gravitas, or perhaps containing actual notes, ever the prepared litigator. "Good morning, grandmother," she said formally. "I apologize for the early hour, but I wanted to speak with you before my flight." "Flight?" I repeated, though I wasn't surprised. Of the three, Juniper would be most likely to make a decisive exit rather than linger in uncomfortable circumstances. "I've rescheduled my return to Boston for this afternoon," she confirmed, taking the seat across from me without waiting for invitation. "Under the circumstances, I believe it's best to resume my normal routine." "I see," I said, sipping my tea. "And have you reached a decision regarding the trust amendments?" Juniper placed her portfolio on the table and folded her hands atop it, a gesture so reminiscent of Harrison presenting his final arguments that it made my heart ache. "I've reviewed the documents thoroughly," she said. "While I believe there might be grounds for contestation based on conditional terms that could be interpreted as coercive control, I recognize that pursuing such a challenge would be costly, time-consuming, and ultimately futile." "A pragmatic assessment," I acknowledged. "And your conclusion?" "I reject the terms," she said flatly. "I will not be emotionally manipulated into performative community service and artificial financial restrictions to prove my worth to you." I nodded, having expected as much. "That is your right." "However," she continued, her voice cool and measured, "I wish to propose an alternative arrangement." This surprised me. "The terms aren't negotiable, Juniper." "I'm not negotiating. The terms of the trust," she clarified. "I'm proposing a separate agreement entirely." She opened her portfolio and removed several typed pages. "I've prepared this overnight. I believe it addresses your concerns while preserving my autonomy." She slid the document across the table. I picked it up, adjusting my reading glasses. The header read, "Personal Covenant between Rosalind Everly Blackwood and Juniper Eleanor Montgomery." "A covenant," I murmured. "Interesting choice of framework." "I thought it appropriate," Juniper said. "More meaningful than a contract, with moral rather than merely legal implications." I scanned the document, impressed despite myself by its comprehensiveness. Juniper had outlined a personal commitment to dedicated pro bono legal work, focusing on elder rights and dignified aging, quarterly financial reporting to me directly with complete transparency about her spending and saving habits, and enrollment in a mentorship program where she would guide first-generation law students from disadvantaged backgrounds. "You've put considerable thought into this," I acknowledged. "I have," she said, "because unlike Laurel, who will cave to your demands out of guilt, or Thorne, who will reject them out of spite, I actually understand what you're trying to accomplish with these amendments." "Do you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You believe we've become entitled, disconnected from the value of work and service that defined your generation. You're using the trust as leverage to instill those values before we have access to wealth that might reinforce our worst tendencies." She paused. "Am I close?" "Remarkably so," I admitted. "Though I would add that my concern isn't generational value differences, it's character. Money doesn't create character flaws, it reveals and amplifies them. And mockery of a grandmother's perceived physical attributes indicates a significant character flaw," Juniper stated matter-of-factly. "I accept that assessment. What I don't accept is your prescribed remedy." I set the covenant aside. "Why not?" "Because it treats us all identically, as if the same approach would be effective for three very different people." Her voice took on a slight edge. Laurel needs structure and guidance. She's drifted her entire life, trying to please everyone while developing no core identity of her own. Thorn needs accountability and purpose. He's wasted his potential because no one has ever truly expected anything from him. And you? I prompted when she paused. I need autonomy, she said simply. I've worked hard to get where I am. I graduated top of my class at Harvard Law. I'm on track for partnership at one of Boston's most prestigious firms. I've never depended on the family name or connections. In fact, I've deliberately kept my relationship to you quiet to ensure my achievements are recognized as my own. A faint smile tugged at my lips. I know. Your mother was quite put out when you asked us not to attend your law school graduation. It wasn't personal, Juniper said stiffly. It felt personal, I countered, just as your comments about my old person smell felt personal. She had the grace to flush slightly. That was inexcusable. Said for Thorn's benefit more than anything. He responds to cruelty with approval. It's a dynamic we developed in childhood. I'm not proud of it. Yet you said it, I pressed. Why? Juniper's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. Because sometimes I resent you, she admitted, the words seeming to surprise even her. Your shadow has loomed over my entire life. Your grandmother was the youngest female judge ever appointed to the circuit. Your grandmother argued before the Supreme Court 3 times. Your grandmother changed state law with her opinions on privacy rights. Do you have any idea what it's like trying to build a legal career with Rosalind Blackwood as your grandmother? I sat back, genuinely taken aback. I never considered my achievements would be a burden to you. They're not a burden, she said quickly. They're an impossibility. No matter what I accomplish, it will never measure up to your legacy. So, yes, sometimes I say cruel things. Sometimes I want to diminish you, to make you human-sized instead of legendary. It's petty and small and beneath me, but it's honest. The silence that followed her confession stretched between us, heavy with decades of unspoken expectations and resentments. I studied my granddaughter's face, the determined set of her jaw, so like Harrison's, the vulnerability in her eyes, that she was working hard to conceal. Thank you for your honesty, I said finally. It's the first real truth you've spoken to me in years. You're welcome, she said, the formality returning like armor being locked back into place. Now, regarding my covenant proposal, I accept it, I interrupted. She blinked, clearly surprised. You do? With 2 conditions, I qualified. First, your quarterly reports will include not just financial transparency, but personal reflection, an assessment of how your choices align with your values, not just your bank balance. She considered this briefly. Acceptable. And the second condition? You will visit me alone for 1 weekend every quarter, not for family obligations or holidays. Just you and me, without the performances we both put on for others. This request visibly unsettled her. To what end? To know each other, I said simply. Not as legends or disappointments, but as women. I would like to know my granddaughter, Juniper. The real one, not the perfect projection you present to the world. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently straightening the already perfectly aligned papers before her. That's asking for considerable vulnerability. Yes, I agreed, from both of us. Another silence, this one contemplative, rather than tense. Finally, she nodded once, decisively. I accept your conditions. Then I accept your covenant, I said, reaching for a pen and signing the document with my full judicial signature. I slid it back to her, and she added her own name beneath mine, her handwriting precise and controlled. I'll have this notarized and send you a copy, she said, slipping the document back into her portfolio. And I'll have Reginald prepare an amendment to your specific trust reflecting our agreement, I replied. She stood, straightening her already immaculate jacket. I should finish packing if I'm to make my flight. Of course. She turned to leave but paused at the door. For what it's worth, she said without turning back to face me, I don't actually think you smell like mothballs. A surprised laugh escaped me. What do I smell like then? She did turn then, the faintest smile softening her features. Like law books and garden roses. Like the chambers where you used to let me sit and color while you wrote opinions. Like home, I suppose. The door closed softly behind her before I could respond, leaving me with a curious lightness in my chest. It wasn't reconciliation. We had too much unsaid between us for that. But it was something equally valuable. A beginning. Mrs. Hudson appeared a short while later with fresh tea and an update on the household. Miss Juniper is indeed packing, Justice Blackwood. Mr. Thorne appears to still be sleeping, and Miss Laurel is in the garden with one of your gardening books of all things. Thank you, Ida, I said. Have there been any calls from my children? Yet? 3 from Mrs. Montgomery since 7 a.m., she confirmed, referring to Eleanor by her married name. And 2 from Mr. Blackwood. I informed them both that you were unavailable but would return their calls this afternoon. I nodded, grateful for the buffer Mrs. Hudson provided. Perfect. And please make arrangements for a car to take Juniper to the airport this afternoon. Already done, she assured me. And regarding the other matter you mentioned yesterday. Yes, I said. Please proceed as discussed. The timing should work perfectly now. Mrs. Hudson smiled knowingly and withdrew, leaving me to contemplate the reactions of my remaining grandchildren. Juniper's response had surprised me, not her initial rejection of the terms, but her counter-proposal. It showed a maturity and self-awareness I'd not given her credit for. Perhaps there was hope yet. The morning passed quietly. I made several calls to colleagues about a legal clinic I was helping establish, reviewed applications for the scholarship fund Harrison and I had created for aspiring public interest attorneys, and deliberately gave my grandchildren space to process their decisions without pressure. Around noon, I made my way to the garden, not coincidentally choosing the path that would take me past the rose trellises where Laurel had stationed herself. She sat cross-legged on the stone bench, one of my advanced gardening manuals open on her lap, making notes in a small spiral notebook. Planning a garden of your own? I asked, pausing beside her. She looked up, shielding her eyes against the midday sun. Not exactly. I was reading about your heirloom roses, the ones from grandfather's family estate in Vermont. The book says they're nearly extinct in commercial cultivation. Yes, I said, surprised by her interest. The Hampshire crimson, they've fallen out of favor because they're difficult to propagate and have a shorter blooming season than modern hybrids. But they're important, Laurel said, gesturing to the deep red blooms climbing the trellis beside her. They're living history. Once they're gone forever. I sat beside her on the bench, intrigued by this unexpected turn in conversation. That's true of many things. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about seeing people as means to ends rather than as human beings with inherent dignity, she said, closing the book carefully. And it made me wonder what else I've been seeing as disposable or valuable only for what it provides me. That's quite a philosophical direction from rose cultivation, I observed. Not really, she replied. These roses don't exist to provide us anything. They're not particularly useful as cut flowers because they drop petals quickly. They're not the most fragrant or the longest blooming. They just are, and that's enough reason to preserve them. I smiled, recognizing Harrison's ecological perspective in her words. He had been the gardener in our family, teaching our children, and later our grandchildren about the interconnectedness of living things. Laurel had been too young when he died to have many memories of those lessons, yet here she was, channeling his wisdom nonetheless. Are you considering botany as a career path now? I asked, only half joking. Maybe, she said, surprising me again. I've never really considered what I'm actually interested in. I just went to business school because it seemed practical and Dad thought it was a good idea. She gestured to the garden around us. But I've always loved it here. Being surrounded by growing things, watching the seasons change the landscape. It feels real, in a way my life in the city never has. Your grandfather would be pleased to hear that, I said. He believed in finding work that nourished the soul as well as the bank account. That's what I want to figure out, Laurel said decisively. What would nourish my soul? What would make me feel like I'm contributing? Something of value, not just consuming resources and waiting for inheritance. That's a worthy pursuit, I said, and in line with the conditions of your trust, I might add. I know, she acknowledged, but I'm not doing it for the trust fund anymore, or at least not primarily for that. I'm doing it because yesterday made me realize how empty my life has been, how shallow and pointless. I don't want to be that person anymore, grandmother. I reached over and covered her hand with mine. Then don't be. It really is that simple, even if the execution is more challenging. I'm staying, she said suddenly. After Juniper leaves and Thorn does whatever Thorn decides to do, I want to stay for a while, if that's all right with you. Of course, I said, genuinely pleased. For how long? I'm not sure, she admitted. I terminated my lease in the city last month. It was too expensive anyway. I thought I'd stay with friends until I figured things out, but maybe this is where I need to be right now. To reconnect with who I was before I started pretending to be someone I'm not. The guest room is yours for as long as you need, I assured her. But I should warn you, I don't run a hotel. If you stay, you'll be expected to contribute to the household. She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in years. I was hoping you'd say that. I want to learn, grandmother, about the gardens, about managing a home like this, about the legal work you still do. I want to learn who you are beyond the grandmother who sends birthday checks and hosts holiday dinners. I felt an unexpected lump in my throat at her words. I'd like that very much, Laurel. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, the summer breeze rustling through the rose trellises around us. Despite the hurt that still lingered from yesterday's revelations, I felt a cautious optimism taking root. Perhaps this painful confrontation had been necessary, the storm that clears the air and allows new growth. Juniper's leaving this afternoon, isn't she? Laurel asked eventually. Yes, I confirmed. She's arranged her own path forward, one that suits her particular strengths and needs. And Thorn? That remains to be seen, I said. Your brother processes things in his own way, on his own timeline. He's angry, Laurel said, stating the obvious. He thinks you're punishing us for hurting your feelings. And what do you think? I asked. She considered this thoughtfully. I think you're trying to save us from ourselves, from becoming the kind of people who would mock their grandmother's smell and count the days until her death just to get their hands on her money. She looked down at the gardening book in her lap. The kind of people who would let these roses die out because they're not immediately useful or profitable. I squeezed her hand gently. Perception is a curious thing. What looks like punishment to one person might be protection to another. Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from the direction of the house, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice raised in uncharacteristic alarm. Laurel and I exchanged concerned glances before hurrying up the garden path toward the commotion. We found a scene of chaos in the main hall. One of Harrison's antique Tiffany lamps lay shattered on the marble floor, its delicate stained glass scattered in jewel-toned shards across the entryway. Thorn stood swaying slightly, in the center of the destruction, a half-empty whiskey tumbler in one hand, his eyes glazed and unfocused. Mr. Thorn, please, Mrs. Hudson was saying, distress evident in her voice. Let me help you to your room. You're not well. I'm fine, Thorne slurred, taking another swig from his glass. Perfectly fine. Just saying goodbye to the family? Heirlooms. Since they're clearly more important than family. His gaze landed on me as I entered, and his expression hardened. Well, well. The honorable judge arrives to pass sentence. How many years for destroying a lamp, Your Honor? Will it cost me another $1 million from my trust fund? Thorne, I said, calmly assessing his condition. Drunk, certainly, but the slurring seemed exaggerated, performative. This was Thorne in one of his dramatic states, playing the role of the dissolute grandson to provoke a reaction. Let's discuss this when you're sober. Let's discuss it now, he countered, gesturing wildly with his glass, sloshing whiskey onto the floor. Let's discuss how you've manipulated and controlled this entire family with your money and your precious reputation. Let's discuss how nothing we ever do is good enough for the great Rosalind Blackwood. That's enough, I said firmly. Mrs. Hudson, please call a car for my grandson. He needs to leave. No need, Thorne sneered. Already packed. Just wanted to leave you with a proper goodbye present. He nudged one of the larger glass shards with his foot. Something to remember me by. Laurel stepped forward, her expression a mix of concern and disappointment. Thorne, stop it. You're making things worse. Am I? He challenged. Or am I finally saying what we've all thought for years? That living up to grandmother's standards is impossible. That no matter what we do, we'll never be good enough for her or grandfather or this family's precious legacy. That's not true, Laurel protested. Isn't it? Thorne turned to me, his eyes suddenly clear despite the alcohol. Tell me, grandmother, was there ever a moment when you were actually proud of me? When I wasn't just a disappointment compared to your perfect husband's memory? The raw pain in his question caught me off guard. Beneath the theatrics and the deliberately provocative behavior was a genuine wound, one I hadn't fully recognized until this moment. Yes, I said quietly. Many times, Thorne. When you taught yourself piano without lessons, when you defended that transgender student in high school even though it cost you your place on the lacrosse team, when you wrote that beautiful eulogy for your grandfather that had the entire church in tears. He blinked, clearly not expecting this response. You never said anything. Perhaps that was my failure, I acknowledged. But pride doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it's quieter, a certainty that the person you're becoming is worthy of the opportunities you've been given. Well, consider this. My resignation from becoming that person, he said bitterly, though some of the fight had gone out of him. I'm done trying to live up to impossible standards. Keep your money. Keep your conditions. I'll make my own way. If that's your choice, I respect it, I said. But destroying family heirlooms won't change the fact that you're still part of this family, whether you reject the financial support or not. Some family, he muttered. One that turns on its own the moment they say something you don't like. No, I corrected. One that holds its members accountable when they reveal character flaws that need addressing. There's a difference. Mrs. Hudson cleared her throat softly. The car has arrived, Justice Blackwood. Thorne downed the last of his whiskey and set the glass on a side table with deliberate care that belied his apparent intoxication. Perfect timing. Goodbye, grandmother. Enjoy your quiet house with your perfect possessions and your moral superiority. This isn't goodbye, Thorne, I said. It's an intermission. When you're ready to have a real conversation about your future, without the dramatics or the performance, my door remains open. He snatched up his duffel bag from where he'd dropped it near the front door, stepping carefully around the scattered glass. Don't hold your breath. As he reached for the door handle, I added, I've had Reginald open a separate account for you. Enough for 6 months of modest living expenses while you figure out your next steps. Not from the trust, from my personal funds. No conditions attached. He froze, his back to me. Why would you do that when I've just destroyed a priceless family heirloom? Because that lamp can be repaired, I said simply. And so, I believe, can you. For a moment, he seemed on the verge of a different kind of response, something genuine beneath the practiced cynicism. Then he straightened his shoulders and pulled open the door. I won't thank you for it, he said, still facing away. I don't expect you to, I replied. But someday, I hope you'll understand why I did it. After he left, Mrs. Hudson efficiently began cleaning up the broken glass, waving away my offers to help. I've already contacted Mr. Finelli about the lamp, Justice Blackwood. He believes it can be fully restored. Apparently, it's not the first time one of these has met with an accident. Thank you, Ida, I said, wondering if she realized the parallel to my last words to Thorne. Some things, and some people, were worth the effort of restoration, no matter how broken they might appear. Laurel knelt beside Mrs. Hudson, carefully gathering the larger pieces of colored glass. Do you think he'll be okay? Eventually, I said. Thorne has always needed to make his mistakes at full volume, learning his lessons the hard way. But he has a good heart beneath all the posturing. He does, Laurel agreed. He just doesn't trust anyone to see it without rejecting him. I nodded, adding this insight to my understanding of my most troubled grandchild. 2 down, 1 settled, I murmured. Not the outcome I expected, but perhaps the one that was needed. By late afternoon, the manor had settled into an uneasy quiet. Juniper had departed for Boston with formal farewells and a promise to send me her first quarterly report within 30 days. Thorne was gone in a cloud of resentment and whiskey. Fumes, though I suspected his dramatic exit was more performance than genuine break. And Laurel had surprised me by not only staying but beginning to integrate herself into the household rhythms, helping Mrs. Hudson prepare dinner and discussing fall planting schedules with Mr. Finch. I retreated to Harrison's study, a room I rarely entered but felt drawn to today. Perhaps it was the confrontations with my grandchildren that made me seek his presence, or perhaps simply the need to ground myself in memories of a partnership that had weathered far greater storms than this family discord. The study remained exactly as Harrison had left it 5 years earlier, his leather chair still positioned at the perfect angle to catch the afternoon light, his legal volumes arranged by subject rather than author, a system that had driven me to distraction during our early years of practice. His collection of wooden boats carved with thorn displayed proudly on the custom shelves he'd built himself. I ran my fingers over his desk, feeling the smooth indentation where decades of writing had worn a shallow groove in the mahogany. So many opinions drafted here, so many letters written, so many family discussions held around this imposing piece of furniture. On the far wall hung a large corkboard where Harrison had pinned family photographs, newspaper clippings, and children's artwork in a chaotic collage that somehow perfectly captured our family's journey. I spotted a faded Polaroid of Eleanor and James building sandcastles at Cape Cod, a program from Juniper's high school debate championship, a crayon drawing by Laurel of Grandpa and me making boats, and a surprisingly moving poem Thorne had written about autumn leaves when he was 9. The central photograph, larger than the others, showed Harrison and me on our wedding day. Not the formal portrait that hung in the main hall, but a candid shot taken moments after the ceremony. We were laughing, my head thrown back in uninhibited joy. Harrison looking at me as if I were the only person in the world. It was the essence of our marriage captured in a single frame, mutual respect, profound friendship, and a love that had only deepened with each passing year. I wish you were here to advise me, old friend, I murmured to the empty room. You always knew when I was being too harsh or too lenient. The silence that answered held no particular wisdom, but the familiar surroundings provided their own comfort. Harrison and I had always approached parenting, and later grandparenting, as a unified front with complementary strengths. I brought clarity and principle. He brought warmth and perspective. Together, we had raised 2 capable, if sometimes misguided, children. But our grandchildren had grown up differently. in fragmented time with us, with parents who increasingly viewed the family legacy as a financial resource rather than a set of values to uphold. Perhaps that disconnection had contributed to yesterday's painful revelations. My phone chimed with an incoming text message, pulling me from my reflections. It was from Eleanor, called 4 times. Need to discuss trust changes immediately. Video call in 30 min? I sighed, knowing this conversation couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Fine, I texted back. I'll be in my study. Eleanor had never been one for patient waiting. Sure enough, my laptop chimed with an incoming video call exactly 28 minutes later. I accepted, and my daughter's face filled the screen, her London apartment visible in the background, all sleek minimalism and carefully curated art, as unlike the warm clutter of Blackwood Manor as possible. Mom, she began without preamble. What on earth are you doing? Juniper just called me in tears. I raised an eyebrow skeptically. Juniper? In tears? I find that difficult to believe. Well, as close to tears as Juniper gets, Eleanor amended. She's devastated by what you've done. Is she? I countered. Because she left here this afternoon with her head held high and a very creative alternative arrangement that satisfied both of us. This clearly caught Eleanor off guard. What arrangement? That's between Juniper and me, I said. But suffice it to say, she's found a path forward that honors her autonomy while addressing my concerns about character development. Eleanor's expression shifted from indignation to calculation. So you're not actually enforcing these ridiculous conditions. For her? I'm enforcing equivalent but personalized conditions, I clarified. Juniper demonstrated both the initiative and maturity to propose a meaningful alternative. She wasn't simply rejecting accountability, she was designing a better framework for it. And what about Laurel and Thorn? Eleanor pressed. Are they getting the same special treatment? Laurel has chosen to accept the original conditions, I said. In fact, she's decided to stay here at the manor for an extended period, to reconnect with family values and explore potential career paths that align with her authentic interests. Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. Laurel's staying with you? Voluntarily? Yes, I confirmed. It was her suggestion, not mine. I believe she's had something of an epiphany about the emptiness of her current lifestyle. And Thorn? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. Thorn needs time to process in his own way. He's rejected the conditions, which is his prerogative. I've provided him with temporary financial support, not from the trust, while he determines his path forward. Eleanor leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping though we were the only people in our respective locations. Mom? What prompted all this? The trust funds have been set up for decades. Why change things now, so suddenly? I considered deflecting, but decided honesty would serve us better. I overheard the grandchildren discussing me in less than flattering terms, specifically mocking my old person smell and speculating about how soon they might inherit my estate. Eleanor's face flushed. Oh, God. Indeed, I said dryly. It was quite enlightening. They're young, Eleanor said weakly. They say thoughtless things. They're adults, I corrected. Juniper is 27, Thorn 25, Laurel 23. Old enough to know better, and certainly old enough to be held accountable for revealing such callous disregard for basic human dignity. Eleanor had the grace to look genuinely embarrassed. I'm so sorry, Mom, truly. That behavior is inexcusable. It's not about the hurt feelings, I said, though in truth the comments had wounded me deeply. It's about the character revealed by such comments. The willingness to mock someone behind their back while accepting their generosity to their face. The transactional view of relationships. The profound entitlement. These are not traits I'm willing to financially enable and amplify with an 8-figure inheritance. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. You heard them talking about your death, she said finally. About how much they'd inherit. That must have been awful. It was clarifying, I corrected, and perhaps necessary. It forced me to consider what legacy I truly wanted to leave. Not just financial assets, but values, character, purpose. Still, Eleanor insisted, changing the trust fund so dramatically seems extreme. Couldn't you have just confronted them? Given them a chance to apologize and do better? That option remains open to them, I pointed out. The conditions aren't punishments, they're pathways to proving they can handle wealth responsibly. Community service, gainful employment, financial literacy, these aren't hardships. They're basic expectations for functioning adults. But to make millions contingent on meeting your specific standards, my standards are hardly unusual, I interrupted. Most people work for decades, contribute to their communities, and learn to manage their resources without the guarantee of a trust fund. I'm simply asking your children to demonstrate that they can function in the real world before receiving wealth that could insulate them from it forever. Eleanor sighed, rubbing her temple. You know this affects James and me too. If the grandchildren contest the changes, it creates a legal mess that impacts the entire family estate. They won't contest, I said confidently. Juniper has already determined it would be futile and financially unwise. Laurel has accepted the terms, and Thorne. I shrugged. Thorne may bluster, but he's practical enough to know when he's outmatched legally. This isn't just about the money for them, Eleanor said after a pause. It's about feeling rejected by you. Like they've failed to meet your standards somehow. They have failed, I said bluntly. Not by making hurtful comments. We all say things we regret. They failed by becoming adults who see other people as means to ends rather than as inherently valuable. Who measure relationships by what they can extract from them. Who believe they're entitled to wealth they didn't create simply by virtue of being born into this family. And whose fault is that? Eleanor challenged, a flash of anger breaking through her diplomatic facade. We raised them with certain expectations. With the understanding that their education would be covered, that they'd have financial support while establishing their careers, that eventually they'd inherit substantial trusts. You and Dad created that framework. We created a framework of privilege, yes, I acknowledged, but not one of entitlement. There's a crucial difference. Your father and I always emphasized that privilege comes with responsibility, to use advantages thoughtfully, to give back to the community, to live with integrity regardless of financial circumstances. Easy for you to say, Eleanor muttered. You and Dad came from nothing, built everything yourselves. The moral high ground was readily available. I raised an eyebrow. And you think that makes it less valid? I think it makes it less applicable, she clarified. The world is different now. Career paths are more uncertain. Housing costs are astronomical. The stability you and Dad created through decades of work seems increasingly unattainable to younger generations without family support. All true, I conceded, which is why the trusts aren't being eliminated, just tied to conditions that ensure the recipients have developed the character to handle wealth responsibly. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her expression softening slightly. You know, Mom, you could have discussed this with James and me before implementing such sweeping changes. We are their parents. The implied criticism stung, but not because it was unfair. You're right, I admitted. I acted hastily, out of hurt and disappointment. That was my mistake. Eleanor looked genuinely surprised by my concession. Well, thank you for acknowledging that. However, I continued, the changes remain in effect. I believe they're necessary corrections to a course that was leading your children toward becoming people neither of us would be proud of. And you get to be the sole arbiter of that? Eleanor challenged. Of my own estate? Yes, I said firmly. just as you have full authority over your assets and how they'll eventually be distributed. But I'm open to hearing your perspective on specific conditions or concerns. This olive branch seemed to mollify her somewhat. I suppose the community service requirement isn't unreasonable. And financial literacy is certainly important. But the employment stipulation seems potentially restrictive. What if they want to start businesses or pursue creative careers with irregular income? The requirement is for gainful employment or entrepreneurial endeavors, I clarified. The specifics are flexible, but the principle is non-negotiable. They must contribute productively to society and support themselves substantially through their own efforts before receiving wealth that could eliminate the need to do so. I see, Eleanor said, her tone suggesting she was reassessing her position. And these conditions expire when they're 35? After that, they receive the full distributions regardless? Correct, I confirmed. By then, they will have either developed the character and skills to manage wealth responsibly, or demonstrated conclusively that they haven't, in which case, the funds will go to the charitable foundations designated as alternate beneficiaries. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying me through the screen. You've thought this through quite thoroughly. I had excellent legal training, I reminded her with a small smile. Yes, well, she sighed. I still wish you'd consulted us first, but I understand your reasoning. And frankly, after hearing what they said about you, she shook her head. Perhaps this wake-up call was necessary. I believe it was, I said, though I take no pleasure in it. What about James? She asked. Have you spoken with him? Not yet, I admitted. He's next on my list after we finish. Good luck with that, Eleanor said with a knowing look. He's always been more protective of his children than I am, especially Thorn. I'm aware, I said dryly. But James also understands consequences better than most. He'll come around. Our conversation wound down with promises to keep each other updated and a tentative plan for Eleanor to visit during the holidays, something she hadn't done in 2 years. As we said our goodbyes, I noticed a subtle shift in her manner, a new respect perhaps, or simply the recognition that I remained my own person with my own authority, not just an aging parent to be managed and eventually inherited from. After ending the call, I sat for a moment in the gathering dusk, considering the conversation. Eleanor's perspective had merit. I should have consulted her and James before making such significant changes, yet her eventual acceptance suggested that, despite her initial reaction, she recognized the underlying issues as clearly as I did. My phone rang again almost immediately. James, right on schedule. Hello, son, I answered. Mom, James began without preamble, his voice tight with controlled anger. What the hell is going on? Thorn just called me completely distraught. Something about you changing the trusts because of some overheard conversation? I sighed inwardly. Where Eleanor was diplomatic and strategic, James was emotional and protective, especially of Thorn, with whom he shared a temperamental similarity. Yes, I confirmed. I made changes to the trust disbursements based on concerning behavior I witnessed from your children. So you're punishing them for what? Some rude comments? Kids say thoughtless things all the time. They're not kids, James, I interrupted. They're adults who were discussing how soon I might die so they could access their inheritance. Adults who referred to me as having old person smell and laughed about how difficult it was to hug me without gagging. There was a brief silence on the line. Oh. Yes, oh indeed, I said. That's inexcusable, James admitted, his tone shifting. I'm sorry they said those things, truly. But changing their entire financial future over it seems extreme. Couldn't you have just confronted them? Given them a chance to apologize? I felt a wave of déjà vu, having just had this exact exchange with Eleanor. The trust modifications aren't punishments, James. They're corrective measures to ensure your children develop the character and capabilities to handle significant wealth responsibly. By forcing them into community service and jobs they might not want? He challenged. By creating conditions that reflect the values this family has always stood for, I countered. Service to others, meaningful work, financial responsibility, self-reliance, the same values your father and I tried to instill in you and Eleanor. That's not fair, James protested. We've tried to teach them those values too. Perhaps, I allowed, but the evidence suggests those lessons haven't taken root as deeply as we might have hoped. Another silence, longer this time. Thorne said you made him leave, that he's cut off. Thorne chose to leave after destroying one of your father's antique lamps, I clarified, and he's not cut off. I've provided him with 6 months of living expenses from my personal funds while he decides whether to accept the trust conditions. He broke Dad's lamp? James sounded genuinely shocked. The Tiffany from Grandma Everly? The very one, I confirmed, though Mrs. Hudson assures me it can be restored. That's not like him, James said, though his tone suggested he wasn't. Entirely convinced of his own statement. Isn't it? I challenged gently. Thorne has always expressed his feelings through dramatic gestures. The only difference is that this time, there were actual consequences. James sighed heavily. I don't know what to do with him sometimes. Mom, he's so talented, so sensitive, but he can't seem to find his place in the world. Every time I think he's getting on track, something happens and he's back to square one. Perhaps because we've always cushioned his falls, I suggested, made excuses for his behavior, provided financial safety nets that removed any real incentive to persist through challenges. You think I've been too soft on him, James said, a defensive edge creeping back into his voice. I think we all have, I corrected. Myself included. We've confused support with enablement. There's a crucial difference. So, this is tough love? Cut him off financially until he meets your standards of proper behavior? Not cut off, I repeated patiently. Conditional. And yes, I suppose it is a form of tough love. Setting boundaries and expectations rather than continuing to fund a lifestyle that's clearly not leading him toward fulfillment or maturity. James was quiet again, processing. When he spoke, his voice had softened. He said you mentioned the boats, the ones he and Dad made together. I did, I confirmed. I reminded him that your father kept every single one, even the earliest, clumsiest attempts, that he believed in Thorne's potential long after Thorne stopped believing in himself. That, James cleared his throat, that was good of you to say. Thorne needs to be reminded of who he was before all the posturing and cynicism took over. I agree, I said, surprised and pleased by this moment of alignment, which is precisely why I structured the trust conditions as I did, to create a path back to that authentic self, the one capable of genuine connection and contribution. I still think you should have talked to us first, James said, though the fight had gone out of his voice. These changes affect our entire family structure. You're right, I acknowledged. I acted hastily, out of hurt and concern. I should have consulted you and Eleanor before implementing such significant changes. Well, James said, clearly taken aback by my ready admission. Yes. Thank you for acknowledging that. However, I continued, I stand by the substance of the changes. They were necessary and, I believe, ultimately beneficial for your children's development. James sighed again. You always did have to have the last word in an argument. A professional hazard of decades on the bench, I said lightly. But in this case, I'm speaking as a grandmother concerned about her grandchildren's characters, not a judge issuing a ruling. Fair enough, James conceded. What about Laurel? Eleanor texted that she's staying with you? Yes, I confirmed. She's decided to take some time to explore her genuine interests and reconnect with family values. It was entirely her idea, and I'm cautiously optimistic about the direction she's heading. Huh, James said, sounding intrigued. That's unexpected. Good for her. Indeed, I agreed. And Juniper has proposed an alternative arrangement that satisfies both her need for autonomy and my concerns about character development. Each of them is finding their own way forward, which is exactly what these changes were intended to facilitate. And Thorn? Thorn's path may take longer and involve more detours, I acknowledged. But I have faith that eventually he'll find his way back to the person your father and I always believed he could become. I hope you're right, James said, his voice tinged with the worry that had characterized much of his relationship with his son. I really do. In the meantime, I suggested, perhaps you could reach out to him, not to fix things or smooth them over, but simply to listen, to let him know that your love isn't contingent on his financial status or his relationship with me. I will, James promised, though he may not be receptive right now. Probably not, I agreed, but the offer itself matters. We talked a while longer about practicalities, the specific trust conditions, the timeline for implementation, the metrics for evaluating compliance. By the end of the conversation, James had moved from angry opposition to reluctant acceptance, even acknowledging that the changes might ultimately benefit his children in ways that simple inheritance could not. As we said our goodbyes, he added, "For what it's worth, Mom, I'm sorry they hurt you. That's not how we raised them to treat family. Especially not you and Dad after everything you've done for all of us." "Thank you, James," I said, touched by his sincere concern. But as I keep saying, this isn't about hurt feelings. It's about ensuring that your father's and my legacy isn't just financial, but moral and ethical as well. Still, he insisted, they should have shown more respect, more gratitude. Perhaps, I allowed. But genuine respect and gratitude can't be demanded. They must be earned and freely given. If these changes help your children develop the capacity for authentic appreciation rather than performative gratitude, then they will have served their purpose. After hanging up, I sat in Harrison's study as darkness fell completely, the room now lit only by the small desk lamp that cast a warm circle of light around me. 2 difficult conversations navigated, with better outcomes than I might have anticipated. Both Eleanor and James had moved from defensive opposition to thoughtful consideration. Not full-throated support, perhaps, but understanding of the underlying principles motivating my actions. A soft knock at the door interrupted my reflections. "Come in," I called, expecting Mrs. Hudson with an update on dinner arrangements. Instead, Laurel appeared, hesitant but determined. "I hope I'm not interrupting, Grandmother." "Not at all," I assured her. "Just finishing some calls with your parents." "Oh," she said, looking suddenly apprehensive. "Are they very angry about the trust changes?" "They were concerned," I acknowledged, "but ultimately supportive of the underlying principles, and pleasantly surprised by your decision to stay here for a while." She nodded, relaxing slightly. "That's good. I was worried they might try to pressure you into reversing everything." "They know better than to attempt that," I said with a small smile. "Even if they disagreed completely, the decision is mine to make." "Because it's your money," Laurel said, echoing my earlier point to James. "Because it's my responsibility," I corrected gently. Money is never just money, Laurel. It's potential, for growth or corruption, for service or selfishness, for freedom or bondage. How we acquire it, how we use it, and how we pass it on speaks volumes about our character and values. She considered this thoughtfully. I never really thought about it that way before. Money was just there. Something we had because we were Blackwoods. A common misconception, I said, but one that these trust modifications are designed to address. Laurel nodded again, then seemed to remember her original purpose for seeking me out. "Mrs. Hudson sent me to tell you dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. And also—" She hesitated, then continued in a rush. "I found something while I was helping clean up Thorn's room. I think you should see it." She handed me a folded piece of paper, creased and slightly crumpled as if it had been discarded and then retrieved. I opened it to find a sketch, clearly Thorne's work, as he'd inherited Harrison's talent for drawing. It showed me seated at my desk in this very study, my expression focused and serene as I reviewed documents. The detail was remarkable. The reading glasses perched on my nose, the particular way I tucked my hair behind my ear when concentrating, even the small scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. At the bottom, in Thorne's distinctive handwriting, was a single line. The judge at work, still intimidating after all these years. He left it crumpled by the wastebasket, Laurel explained. I don't think he meant for anyone to see it. I studied the drawing, noting the care taken with every line, the obvious time invested in capturing not just my likeness, but something of my essence as well. It was not the work of someone who saw me merely as a path to inheritance, but of someone who had observed me closely with both respect and affection. Thank you for showing me this, Laurel, I said, carefully refolding the paper. It's quite revealing. In a good way, I hope, she said, watching me closely. Yes, I confirmed. In a very good way indeed. 3 months passed with remarkable swiftness. The summer heat gave way to autumn's crisp embrace, painting Blackwood Manor's extensive grounds in brilliant shades of amber and crimson. The gardens transformed under nature's artistic hand, and with them, subtle transformations occurred within the manor's walls as well. Laurel had indeed stayed, settling into the East Wing guest suite as if it had always been meant for her. Each morning she rose early to join Mr. Finch in the gardens, wearing mud-stained jeans and oversized flannel shirts that would have horrified her fashion-conscious former self. Her hands, once meticulously manicured, now bore the honorable calluses of meaningful labor. She had enrolled in a local horticulture program, focusing on rare plant conservation and sustainable gardening practices, a decision that had initially surprised her parents, but now garnered their cautious support. With my permission, she had converted the manor's unused sunroom into a propagation space for endangered native plant species, including a particular variety of woodland orchid that had nearly vanished from New England's forests. When she spoke about her work, her face illuminated with a passion I had never seen in her before, not for designer handbags or exclusive social events, but for preserving something genuinely irreplaceable. Juniper had been true to her word, sending me detailed quarterly reports, not just of her financial management, but also of her expanding pro bono work with elderly clients facing housing discrimination and predatory financial practices. Her writing in these reports started formally, almost clinically detached, but gradually revealed more personal reflections. Her frustration with a legal system that often failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens, her satisfaction in securing a favorable ruling for an elderly veteran facing eviction, her growing mentorship of a first-generation law student from rural Appalachia. Most surprisingly, she had actually visited for a weekend in early October, just the two of us as agreed. Our initial interactions were stiff and cautious, laden with decades of unspoken expectations and comparisons. But on the second evening, as we shared a bottle of Harrison's favorite Bordeaux in front of the library fireplace, something shifted. I always thought you wanted me to be exactly like you, Juniper had said, staring into her wineglass. To follow your exact path, make your exact choices. And you resented that, I observed. Wouldn't you? She challenged, meeting my eyes directly. To feel like nothing you achieve is ever really yours? That you're just recreating someone else's life? I never wanted that for you, I said quietly. I wanted you to find your own path with the advantages I never had. To stand on my shoulders, certainly, but to see your own horizon, not just retrace my footsteps. She'd considered this, swirling the wine thoughtfully. I'm not sure I believe that entirely, but I'm willing to consider it might be true. It wasn't reconciliation, Not completely, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of professional perfection she'd built between us. She left with a promise to return at Thanksgiving, a commitment that felt more genuine than any holiday obligation of years past. Thorne remained the most elusive. He had used the 6 months of living expenses I'd provided to secure a small apartment in Portland, Maine, far enough from Blackwood Manor to assert his independence, but close enough to suggest he hadn't completely severed ties. Through James, I learned he had found work as a line cook at a waterfront restaurant. Humble labor that would have been unthinkable to the entitled young man who'd shattered Harrison's lamp in a fit of pique. He hadn't contacted me directly, but twice he'd sent packages to the manor. The first contained the framed sketch of me that Laurel had found discarded in his room, now carefully matted and presented. The second held a hand-carved wooden box with exceptionally detailed rose patterns. Clearly his own work, reminiscent of the boats he'd made with Harrison but demonstrating more advanced techniques. No note accompanied either gift, but none, was necessary. They spoke volumes about regret, effort, and tentative reconciliation. On this particular October evening, as twilight descended over the manor grounds, I sat in my study reviewing applications for the legal scholarship fund Harrison, and I had established decades earlier. Mrs. Hudson entered with a tea tray, her timing as impeccable as always. "Perfect, Ida," I said gratefully. My eyes needed a break from these essays. "You've been at it for hours, Justice Blackwood," she observed, setting down the tray. "Some exceptional candidates this year?" "Several," I confirmed, "including a young woman from coal country whose essay reads remarkably like my own application to law school 50 years ago." Mrs. Hudson smiled knowingly as she poured the tea. "The wheel turns, doesn't it?" "Indeed it does," I agreed. "Any word from Miss Laurel? She's usually back from her classes by now." "She called to say she's staying late at the greenhouse. Apparently, one of her orchid specimens is showing signs of sprouting a second stem. Quite rare, she tells me." I smiled, warming to the enthusiasm in Mrs. Hudson's voice. Laurel had won over even my staunchest ally with her genuine transformation. "She'll be talking our ears off about it over dinner, no doubt." "No doubt," Mrs. Hudson agreed. She hesitated, then added, "There was a call while you were working, from Mr. Thorne." I set down my teacup carefully. "Did he leave a message?" "Just that he'd try again later," she said. "He sounded steady, sober." "Thank you, Ida," I said, absorbing this small but significant update. Thorne calling directly rather than through James was a noteworthy development. As Mrs. Hudson left, I turned my attention to the window, watching autumn's early darkness settle over the gardens Laurel had helped bring back to life. The past 3 months had brought changes I could never have anticipated the day I'd overheard my grandchildren's cruel mockery of my old person smell. Changes that stemmed from that painful moment, but had grown into something far more profound than simple consequences for hurtful behavior. The jarring ring of the study phone interrupted my reflections. "Blackwood residence," I answered, my judicial formality never quite abandoned even in personal calls. "Grandmother?" Thorne's voice, hesitant but clear. "It's me." "Thorne," I acknowledged, keeping my tone neutral despite the leap of hope in my chest. "Mrs. Hudson mentioned you called earlier." "Yeah, I wasn't sure you'd take my call." "Why wouldn't I?" I asked. A pause, then a soft exhale. "Because the last time we spoke, I smashed one of Grandfather's antiques and stormed out like a petulant teenager." "Water under the bridge," I said, though we both knew it wasn't quite that simple. "How are you, Thorne?" He seemed to consider his answer carefully. "I'm doing better. Working at this restaurant on the waterfront. Nothing fancy, just prep and line cooking, but it's grounding. Real." "Your father mentioned something about that," I said. "Do you enjoy the work?" Another pause, as if this question required serious contemplation. Parts of it, yeah. I like the immediate feedback. You either cook something properly or you don't. No gray areas, no subjective judgments, just direct cause and effect. That sounds refreshing after years of creative pursuits with ambiguous standards, I observed. Exactly, he said, sounding pleased that I understood. And there's something about the physical tiredness at the end of a shift that feels earned. Different from being exhausted from partying or stressed about nothing in particular. Productive fatigue, I suggested. Yeah, that's it. He fell silent again, and I waited, sensing he had more to say. Finally, he continued, I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day, about grandfather believing in me long after I stopped believing in myself. He did, I confirmed simply. I found some of his old woodworking journals when I was setting up my apartment, Thorne said. He'd written notes about teaching me, plans for projects we never got to finish before he died. I closed my eyes briefly, picturing Harrison's meticulous handwriting, his detailed sketches and careful measurements. He kept every drawing you ever made, you know. Every boat, every carving attempt. I know, Thorne said softly. I've been trying to remember what it felt like back then, working with him in his shop. How focused I was. How it felt to create something with my hands that hadn't existed before. And have you remembered? I asked. Sometimes, he admitted. I've been carving again. Small things at first, but lately more complex pieces. It helps. Quiet my mind. Makes me feel connected to him somehow. The wooden box you sent, I said. It's exquisite, Thorne. Your grandfather would have been immensely proud. Thanks, he said, his voice catching slightly. That means a lot. We were both quiet for a moment, the phone line humming with unspoken emotions. Then Thorne cleared his throat. Actually, that's partly why I'm calling. I've been commissioned to create a set of handcrafted serving boards for the restaurant, my first paid woodworking job. The owner saw some pieces I was working on during breaks. Congratulations, I said sincerely. That's wonderful news. It is, but... He hesitated. The thing is, I need better tools than what I've cobbled together in my apartment. And I was wondering... If you could use your grandfather's workshop, I finished for him. Yeah, he confirmed. I know it's a lot to ask after everything, but his tools are just sitting there and... The workshop is yours whenever you want it, Thorne, I said. It always has been. Your grandfather intended it that way. Really? The surprise in his voice made my heart ache. Had he truly believed I would deny him this connection to Harrison? Really, I assured him. In fact, I've had Mr. Finch maintaining the equipment monthly, keeping everything oiled and in working order. Just in case. Just in case I came back, he said, understanding. Just in case you found your way back to yourself, I corrected. Gently. Which, it seems, you have begun to do. Another silence, this one thick with emotion. Thank you, he said finally. I don't deserve your faith in me. It's not about deserving, Thorne. It's about recognizing potential and providing the conditions for it to flourish, which, you might recall, was the entire point of the trust modifications. He laughed softly, the sound startling in its genuineness. Touché, Your Honor. Always. The strategist. So when might we expect you? I asked, moving past the moment of vulnerability to practical matters. This weekend? He suggested tentatively. I have Saturday and Sunday off. I could drive down Friday night after my shift. If that works for you? That works perfectly, I said. Laurel will be here as well. She's been living at the manor these past months, working on a horticulture project. So I heard, Thorne said. Dad mentioned she's gone full Earth Mother. Plants and dirt and saving endangered species or something. She's found her passion, I said simply. As it seems you may be finding yours. Maybe, he acknowledged. It's early days yet. Everything worthwhile begins with maybe, I observed. After we said our goodbyes, I sat with the phone in my hand for several moments, absorbing the unexpected turn of events. Thorne coming to the manor voluntarily, reconnecting with Harrison's workshop, pursuing creative work that had meaning beyond monetary value. These were developments I wouldn't have dared hope for 3 months ago. My reverie was interrupted by Laurel bursting into the study, her cheeks flushed with excitement and a smudge of potting soil gracing her forehead. "Grandmother, you won't believe what happened with the Cypripedium reginae seedlings. 2 of them have developed double shoots, which Dr. Abernathy says happens in less than 3% of propagation attempts." I smiled at her enthusiasm, so genuine and unaffected compared to the polished performance of interest she would have given just months ago. "That's wonderful news, Laurel," though I confess the botanical significance escapes me somewhat. "It means they're exceptionally vigorous," she explained, perching on the edge of my desk with comfortable familiarity. "More likely to survive transplantation to wild habitats. We could potentially help re-establish colonies that have been extinct for decades." "A worthy legacy," I observed. "Exactly," she beamed. "Oh, and the Conservation Trust called. They've approved my grant proposal for expanding the greenhouse facilities. It's not a huge amount, but enough to get started with the expansion plans." "Congratulations," I said warmly. "You've worked hard for that recognition." "I couldn't have done it without you letting me convert the sunroom," she acknowledged, "or letting me stay here all these months." "You've more than earned your place," I assured her. "Your contribution to the manor has been substantial. Not just the gardening work, but the energy you've brought back to these old rooms." Laurel smiled, absently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, seemingly untroubled by the dirt under her fingernails, a detail that would have horrified her former self. "It's funny how things work out, isn't it? 3 months ago, I was devastated about the trust changes. Now, I barely think about the money at all. There's so much more importance in the work itself." "The money was never the true inheritance," I said. "It was always the values, the purpose, the capacity for meaningful contribution." "I think I finally understand that," she said thoughtfully. "Speaking of family, have you heard from Juniper lately? She promised to call me about Thanksgiving plans but hasn't gotten back to me." "She's in trial this week," I explained. "A pro bono case for an elderly client facing eviction. But she's confirmed she'll be here for Thanksgiving. Just sent me her flight information yesterday." "That's good," Laurel said. "It would be nice to have everyone together again. Well, almost everyone." Her expression dimmed slightly, thinking of Thorne. "Actually," I said, unable to suppress a small smile, "I just got off the phone with your brother. He's coming this weekend to use your grandfather's workshop. He's received a woodworking commission from the restaurant where he works." Laurel's eyes widened. "Thorne is coming here? Voluntarily? And he's actually working, like, with his hands and everything?" "Indeed," I confirmed. "Life is full of surprises." "That's... wow," she said, genuinely stunned. "I didn't think he'd set foot in this house again after the lamp incident." "People can change when given the right motivations," I observed. "Speaking of which, how is your community service commitment progressing?" Laurel had chosen to fulfill her trust conditions by developing educational programs for underprivileged children at the botanical gardens associated with her horticulture program, work that had quickly become a passion rather than an obligation. "Amazing," she said enthusiastically. "We've got 30 kids from the Northside housing projects coming twice weekly now. You should see them, grandmother. Some of these children have never grown anything before, never seen a seed sprout because of their care. The look on their faces when they harvest their first radishes or carrots." She shook her head, wonder in her expression. "It's the best thing I've ever done." "I'd love to visit the program sometime," I said, "if that wouldn't disrupt things." "Are you kidding? The kids would be thrilled," Laurel said. "Especially if you wore your judge robes. They're fascinated by anyone with an interesting job. Most of them only see limited options in their neighborhoods." "Consider it done," I said, touched by her immediate inclusion rather than embarrassment at the prospect of her grandmother visiting. "Perhaps next week?" "Perfect," she agreed, standing and brushing potting soil from her jeans. "I should clean up before dinner. Mrs. Hudson said something about pot roast tonight." After she left, I turned back to the scholarship applications, though my mind kept drifting to the unexpected developments of the day. Thorne returning to the manor and Harrison's workshop. Laurel finding purpose in conservation and education. Juniper honoring our agreement and planning her Thanksgiving visit. 3 months ago, I had acted from a place of hurt and concern, changing the trust conditions in response to overheard cruelty. I had hoped, of course, that the modified terms would encourage my grandchildren to develop stronger characters and more meaningful lives. But even in my most optimistic moments, I hadn't anticipated such profound transformations in such a relatively short time. The dinner bell chimed softly, calling me to the dining room where Laurel and Mrs. Hudson would be waiting. As I gathered my papers and prepared to join them, my phone chimed with an incoming text message. It was from Eleanor. "Just heard from James about Thorne's visit this weekend. Thinking I might come for Thanksgiving after all if the invitation still stands. Miss you, Mom." I smiled to myself, adding this unexpected olive branch to the day's collection of small miracles. "Always welcome," I texted back. "The door is open whenever you're ready to walk through it." As I made my way to dinner, I passed Harrison's portrait in the main hall. For a moment, I paused before it, studying the familiar features rendered in oil and canvas. "You were right, old friend," I murmured to the painting. "Sometimes the most valuable gifts are the ones that challenge rather than comfort." The portrait offered no response, of course, but I could almost hear Harrison's deep chuckle, could almost see the knowing twinkle in his eyes. He had always believed in setting high standards and expecting people to rise to meet them, not from rigidity or control, but from profound faith in human capacity for growth and redemption. In the dining room, Laurel was already seated, her freshly washed hair still damp, animated as she described her day's botanical discoveries to a patiently attentive Mrs. Hudson. The room felt warm, alive in a way it hadn't since Harrison's passing. Not just occupied, but inhabited with purpose and genuine presence. "Sorry I'm late," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. A few last-minute communications. "Everything all right?" Laurel asked, passing the bread basket. "More than all right," I assured her. "Just family matters falling into place." As Mrs. Hudson served the pot roast, Harrison's favorite meal, I surveyed the scene before me with quiet satisfaction. The trust modifications had been a gamble, one that could have backfired spectacularly. Instead, they had catalyzed transformations I scarcely could have imagined 3 months earlier. My grandchildren were finding their ways, different paths, aligned with their unique strengths and authentic interests, but all leading toward lives of purpose and integrity, not because they had to meet my standards to receive their inheritances, but because they were discovering the far greater inheritance of knowing who they truly were and what they genuinely valued. And as for me, the grandmother they had once mocked for my old person smell, the source of wealth they had once awaited with barely disguised impatience, I too had been transformed. No longer just the family matriarch to be tolerated until inheritance day, but a person in my own right, with wisdom still to share and relationships still to nurture. It wasn't perfect, of course. Relationships rarely are. There would be setbacks and disagreements, old patterns reasserting themselves in moments of stress. Thorne's recovery would likely include backsliding. Juniper's professional ambitions might again create distance. Laurel's newfound purpose might evolve in unexpected directions. But we had found our way back to the essential truth that had always been the foundation of Blackwood Manor, that a family's true wealth lies not in its bank accounts or trust funds, but in its capacity to grow together through challenge and change, to hold each other accountable with both firmness and compassion, and to recognize that the most valuable inheritance is not what we are given, but what we earn through our own choices and efforts. As I raised my water glass in silent toast to Harrison's memory, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just contentment with the past, but genuine anticipation for the future. A future shaped not by financial distributions or legal documents, but by the authentic character and conscientious choices of generations to come. The trust fund terms I had changed that evening 3 months ago had indeed altered my grandchildren's financial future. But far more importantly, they had changed the course of our family's true legacy. One measured not in dollars, but in dignity, purpose, and genuine connection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.